Alright, it's June 2019 at the last real E3, and there's an announcement. It's a collaborative project between Hidetaka Miyazaki, the director of the Dark Souls games and president of From Software, and George R.R. Martin, the creator of A Song of Ice and Fire, which was adapted into Game of Thrones, the most popular fantasy series ever, really. So the creators of the most popular gaming fantasy series and the most popular literary fantasy series are collaborating on a project. Most people correctly assume that's just going to be a fantasy project, but there were a handful of schizos that believed this was secretly going to be a sci-fi project, and here's why. I'll start with the delay between the announcement and any new information at all. People know that Miyazaki's working on it, people know that George is working on it, and they have this trailer. And until early 2021, where concept art images leaked and an internal trailer leaked, this is all people had. People on 4chan and Reddit basically said, it's been X days since we last heard anything about Elden Ring. It's been 100 days, it's been 200 days, it's been a full year. So the thing about huge projects like this is when people don't get new information for a long time, they just dig as deep as they possibly can into the little information they have. What information did they have? Basically, it consisted of the single trailer, which we'll look into, various Miyazaki interviews, and George's past works. Alright, Miyazaki's interviews. Starting with a March 2016 Vice interview, Miyazaki said a couple interesting things. First, he said, I want to work on a mix of fantasy and mecha genres, but other people at From Software would think that would be an impossible idea. Then a bit later in the interview, the interviewer makes a joke about a Dark Souls 3 DLC, where you take control of Tower Knight and you fight the White Glint from Armored Core. Kind of a shit joke, but Miyazaki responds, you know, we actually released a Dreamcast game pretty similar to that concept named Frame Gride. It's a mix of fantasy and mecha genres, both of which I love working on. I'd love to work on a game that evokes the same themes as an anime series like Aura Battle or Dubin and The Vision of Escaflowne, but it would be incredibly difficult to do so. I want to work on a game like that, but other people at From Software would think that would be an impossible idea. Aura Battle or Dunbean and Escaflowne are both series that blend sci-fi and fantasy. Next up, there's another 2016 interview by Rolling Stone. The question is, you tell me you're a bookworm, what kind of books would I find on your shelf if I were to look right now? A shelf is packed with novels, old classics of fantasy and science fiction, alongside George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and Fever Dream. You're a big fan of gothic stuff then. I'm an omnivore when it comes to sources. Many of the themes and imagery expressed in our games have their origins in text, things conjured in the imagination while reading. The interpretations within the mind. In another interview, Miyazaki was asked if they were making a new Armored Core. He replied, we are making a new Armored Core. We are still in the early stages of development. I asked how early, and Miyazaki replied, I can't talk about how early it is. So how is a new Armored Core game being in development relevant to this? Well, Miyazaki announced it was in development back in 2016. So when people were forming this theory in 2020, a lot of people had sort of assumed that the game had been canceled. And if there's one thing From Software is known for, the people who look into their game development, it's how they're very efficient with their assets. They reuse assets from game to game. It doesn't matter which series it's from. They'll take it from one game and graft it into another. You can find stuff from Sekiro, you can find stuff from Demon Souls and Dark Souls. Zullie the Witch has several good videos on this sort of thing, so if you're interested, you should take a look at those. It's not unsurprising that people would think that this new Armored Core game was cancelled, and that the unused assets would be cannibalized to be put in a new game. Then, in an Xbox Wire interview at E3 2019, the interviewer asked, Regarding the collaboration with George R.R. Martin, can you further explain how this collaboration came about and in what role it has served throughout the project? Miyazaki says, I suppose the start of this collaboration came from the fact that I myself am a huge fan of Mr. Martin's work. I loved A Song of Ice and Fire as well as the Tough Voyaging series. However, if I had to pick a favorite, I would probably say Fever Dream. That leads us into the third point for the foundation of the schizo theory, George R.R. Martin's previous works. George R.R. Martin is most known for A Song of Ice and Fire. It's sort of his breakout hit that became the most popular fantasy series of the modern day. But before that, he mostly wrote stuff that was labeled as sci-fi. But he's always been interested in blending sci-fi and fantasy. A lot of his stories feature things like space travel, as well as primitive worlds that kind of resemble medieval fantasy settings. And a lot of them feature psionics. They have monsters and swords and esoteric abilities, so he's been blending them for a while, fantasy and sci-fi. Particularly in his Thousand Worlds universe, he's blurred the line as much as he can.
What about the relationships between science fiction and fantasy? You have started out writing science fiction stories, now you're known as a fantasy writer. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the choices you make when you choose to write a story in one genre or the other, and what relationships you think there are between them.
Well, that's an interesting subject. Yes, when I started out writing in the early 70s, I did a few fantasies early on. I've been published in fantastic magazines, one of the digest magazines of the day. But predominantly, I published in Analog and Amazing, and the magazines were identified as science fiction magazines, and I wrote a lot of stuff that were set on other planets with aliens and starships and all of that stuff. I think a lot of that was not because I preferred science fiction to fantasy. I loved them both. I loved the worlds I created and some of the stories I told. I'm still very proud of. But I look back on it now and saying, I was writing fantasy all along. I mean, I'm not a hard science guy like Stan. Everything that I know about science, I learned from science fiction stories. So my science fiction stories, if you look at them crookedly here, are really space fantasy. I'm using aliens instead of elves or whatever. It's a furniture difference rather than a quantitative difference. And I actually believe that science fiction and fantasy are just two flavors of the same thing. I mean, one of them is chocolate ice cream and one of them is strawberry ice cream, but they're both ice cream, and they taste really good.
Elden Ring.
There's a few lines in the announcement trailer that caught people's attention.
That which commanded the stars, giving life its fullest brilliance.
Some people thought Elden Ring could be referring to a megastructure, like the ring from Halo or a Dyson sphere. Other people thought it might be more akin to the rings of Saturn, the ring of debris that forms around some planets.
Don't tell me you don't see it. Look up at the sky. It burns.
People thought this might be referring to like an atmospheric phenomenon or a meteor shower, something falling from the sky, something happening in space that's distorting the atmosphere. So you take a few interesting lines from the announcement trailer, you take Miyazaki's interest in making a game that blends sci-fi and fantasy, akin to Escaflowne or Dunbin, and you take George R.R. Martin's interest in blending sci-fi and fantasy, as well as his history of blending sci-fi and fantasy. So you take all these factors and you blend them together and it becomes the foundation for this theory. The theory that Elden Ring was going to have a twist that revealed it was secretly a sci-fi game the whole time. So then the big gap happens. The game was announced in June 2019, and then until early 2021 people didn't hear anything at all. Nothing to do but speculate. In early 2021, some concept art leaked, a version of the map leaked, which, interestingly enough, had a big crater, so people thought, hey, maybe this is the site of a meteor strike. Then they saw the leaked internal trailer, Most of the stuff in the leak trailer is unrelated to this theory, but at the end, we see the Rennala boss fight arena, and people see the giant moon. And at this point, people are convinced that even if there's no sci-fi twist, this game is going to be focused on the moon. A little later, a trailer that was supposed to be released comes out. There's a short, just 1 or 2 second clip of the fire giant's eye, and people made an interesting little connection. That it's probably inspired by this ongoing storm at like the south pole of Jupiter. No one really thought it was likely that this game was going to take place on Earth and Jupiter was going to be relevant, but this was considered to be like a tip of the hat to people who are interested in space and all this sci-fi stuff. So it was just another point in favor of the sci-fi theory. November 2021, people got access to the network test. Basically, a small amount of people were invited for 3 hours a day, like 5 days, to play in a severely cut down version of the game, just Limgrave, just a chunk of Limgrave. But what really matters here is they got to look at the moon, and they got to see that there was a big rune on the moon. So moon guys were happy about that. Moon chads rise up. Moon chads stay winning. And beyond that, there were the item descriptions. We finally got some details on the confirmed lore. It's not just speculation from trailers. Oh, it was the North Pole of Jupiter. And now that we had item descriptions, the proper schizo theories could manifest. Like this guy. There's that generic stone shard item, but it mentions it's from a temple of the sky. People thought this might be a space station. I think these are glintstone shards, thrown at the ground to create a gravitational shockwave. People who search for these shards dub themselves star callers. So that doesn't point to anything sci-fi related, but it does show that this game is focused on like extraterrestrial cosmology. Glintstone is the amber of the cosmos. Golden amber contains the remnants of ancient life and houses its vitality, while glintstone contains residual life, and thus the vitality of the stars. That which commanded the stars, giving life its fullest brilliance. Just one line in the announcement trailer, and some guys like this held on to it for years. I like this one where someone compares the glyph that appears when you cast the meteorite spell. And then they went back to look at the original announcement trailer, and they see that a sword has something that looks kind of similar. And then they compare both of these things to Earth's magnetic field. So clearly this is science-based magic, right? That's the only reasonable conclusion anyone could draw from this. It couldn't be reusing assets, or just some guy at From Software thinking this was a cool pattern. This must be a secret reference to Earth's magnetic field. VaatiVidya did what he does, and he jumped the gun to talk about the possible lore implications of things found in the network test.
Earth obscured behind clouds, eternally out of sight. At one point, a huge robot from that place falls to Earth, and what do you know? One such giant exists in Elden Ring as well, or at least I think. But what caused this fall? Well, if we look at some leaked concept art of Elden Ring's map, one can't help but notice the enormous crater at the center of the lands between. Now, this crater could have been caused by the falling Sky Temple, but a crater like this feels like it was caused by a meteorite. Some folks even call themselves Starcallers. And stars and the cosmos, these are incredibly important concepts in Elden Ring's lore. In fact, stars and their vitality are the entire basis for entire branches of sorcery in this game. These giant half-stone vessels, also found in the network test, are probably a type of astrolabe, and an astrolabe is an ancient astrological instrument.
And then the game came out. February, I think. And how much of this sci-fi theory was right? Basically none of it. Yeah, it turns out the game didn't have any advanced technology, it didn't have any modern technology. Closest thing it did have was extraterrestrials. You see, with fantasy, aliens are usually extraplanar or extra-dimensional. And I think Elden Ring does have those, but in addition to that, it had extraterrestrial aliens, which basically just means they're from outer space. Estelle, natural born of the void, and those little stone-looking boar enemies you fight, yeah, they're extraterrestrial aliens who crash-landed here to fuck around with the planet. Greater Will, it sent the Erd tree to plant itself and influence everything in the lands between directly. So if you consider extraterrestrial aliens sci-fi, then sure, there's a little bit of sci-fi in there. But beyond that, it's like the temple in the sky was not a space station. It was an actual just temple in the sky. Like the Erd Tree was not a space elevator or a hangar for mechs. There were no unused Armored Core assets because Armored Core was announced a couple years later. It just took a while. It was probably in development hell, just like Elden Ring. I'm sure it does suck for some people that their theories were completely wrong, but this is half of the fun of getting hype over video games. So when you see some cool shit in a trailer at a show, and then you get worked up with your community thinking of all the ways that it could be amazing. I miss this sort of thing. Like, I wasn't hyped for Elden Ring like these guys were, but I do remember doing similar stuff for games way back in the day. Anyway, hopefully we do get that mecha fantasy game Miyazaki talked about in those interviews. As for George R.R. Martin's blending of fantasy and sci-fi thing, well, I'm sure he does believe that to a certain extent. But what I don't believe is that he was too invested in Elden Ring. Here's an interview from a few weeks before the game came out.
I know that you've recently been a part of developing a video game, and it seems to me like it's sort of a natural fit for a fantasy fiction writer to work on a video game. How is that, different from what we know you for working on?
Well, it actually is considerably different. I've played some video games. I'm not a big video gamer, but the game is called the Elden Ring, and it's a sequel to a video game that came out a few years ago called Dark Souls, and it came out of Japan. My work on it was actually done years ago. These games, they're like movies. They take a long time to develop. Basically, they wanted a world created to set the game in. They wanted world building as a big factor in fantasy and science fiction. You're not only talking about the characters and the plot, but the setting is almost as important as everything else. Tolkien's Middle-earth, Robert E. Howard's Hyborian Age, the foundation universe of Isaac Asimov. I worked up fairly detailed background for them. And then they took it from there. So, it's been several years since I've last seen them, but they would come in periodically and show me some monsters they designed or the latest special effects or the cool things. But the game has been very slowly developing, and now it's coming out in January, I believe. So I'll be as excited as anybody else to see it.
First off, he thought it was a sequel to Dark Souls. Come on. Like, I guess if you're being generous, you could say that he was calling it a spiritual successor, but I really do think he thought it was a sequel to Dark Souls. And the rest of it's like, I get the impression he did work on some of the names and some of the lore, like the skeleton of the setting, but then there was never any follow-up. Like, Miyazaki and the From Software guys just took it from there, and then they would occasionally show him some of their cool shit, and he would go, oh, that's cool. I don't think he was actively on the team working with them. Like he said, it'd been a couple of years since they'd done any actual collaboration. So, I can't prove this, but as far as I'm concerned, they just got the guy for his name. When they started working with him, Game of Thrones wasn't like a disgraced series. People still considered him and his series the undisputed king of fantasy. So yeah. This is why I don't put too much weight on interviews. People get asked questions and then they come up with whatever they think is cool on the spot. Most people aren't meditating in a dark room for hours beforehand to perfectly have what they're going to say in alignment with their true beliefs. They just kind of toss out whatever sounds good. Whew. I haven't played Night Rain though, so maybe they added fucking mechs in there. I wouldn't know. Maybe you get to fight White Glint. Maybe they're gonna have Night Rain DLC where you fight White Glint from Armored Core. Oh. They're already taking a bunch of assets from Dark Souls to use in Night Rain, so might as well take some from Armored Core. It's not like anyone cares about the lore of that game. What am I saying? Of course they do. I'm sure VaatiVidya has made like 38 videos on Night Rain, half of which came out before the game did. Thank you for watching. Please consider subscribing. I'm trying to get to 1,000, so thanks.